Hi, welcome back to the podcast. I hope whoever's listening to this, you're doing really, really well and enjoying the summer that we're currently having, or whatever time of year it is that you're listening to this. I'm going to jump straight into the content of today's episode because I have a lot of notes to get through. I had a lot to say on this topic. We're going to be talking about perfectionism, which I think is something that I'm really interested in because it has had a massive impact on a lot of my life, specifically academic perfectionism. I'm going to be talking a lot about, and sort of how I've come to understand it and how it influences a lot of my behaviour and things that I have used or heard of or come to understand that have helped me diminish the negative effect that it has on my life. I want to start by chatting about my thoughts on an interesting trend that did the rounds on social media a while back, and it was lots of people making videos showing themselves doing things like pouring milk into a mug of coffee and spilling or splashing a bit on the side, and so having a huff and emptying the whole carton of milk onto the kitchen surface, or carrying a basket of laundry through the house, dropping a sock out of it, and so throwing the whole basket on the floor, that kind of stuff. I thought they were a really good analogy for perfectionist behaviour, and I do think that they illustrated well how perfectionism can be harmful and how it can lead to us not trying or giving up or giving in to harmful behaviours. And I think it tries to demonstrate how irrational perfectionism is. But I do think, obviously I know a video trend isn't going to encompass everything that can be said about a topic, but I think those videos in particular miss something that I think is really crucial to understanding perfectionism, which is what got me wanting to do this episode. And that is how perfectionism warps our sense of logic, which can make seemingly irrational and illogical behaviour seem very reasonable and logical to people with perfectionist tendencies. I personally think this is a key puzzle piece in understanding perfectionist behaviours and tendencies, and I also personally think it's one of the most damaging parts of it. And like I've said before, I think the more understanding and awareness we have of a specific issue, the more equipped we are to better deal with it and minimise the negative effect that it has on our lives. I want to chat a little bit about my personal experience with perfectionism. For me, it was probably the most intense and had a particularly iron grip over my behaviour whilst I was studying at school in my later teen years and in uni. I think especially in uni, I have very extreme standards for myself in terms of how many hours I had to spend studying and practicing my violin. I did a music degree in performance. I play the violin. For anybody who hasn't listened before, doesn't know, I have very high standards for myself in terms of how long I had to spend practicing and what grades I had to get. I do find that it still crops up in other areas of my life for me as well. So things like body image and my appearance, sometimes I will get perfectionist-y about, and things like if I'm trying to implement new lifestyle habits, or say I'm trying a new workout, if I can't do something perfectly straight away, I'll find that sometimes I get frustrated with myself. But I think I am going to be talking a lot about, or mostly about, academic perfectionism today. And I think specifically in terms of that video, it's probably easiest to link it to my experience of academic perfectionism. Whilst I was studying at uni, there was this 4 hours of practice a day figure that floated around and was by no means a hard and fast optimum rule that every single student aimed for daily. But I think if you said that you were doing individual instrument practice for 4 hours a day consistently, most people would be impressed and deem that to be a good and acceptable, respectable amount of personal practice to be doing. And Itzhak Perlman, who's a really famous violinist, was quoted to have said that basically people shouldn't be doing more than 4 or 5 hours absolute max practice a day. So certainly in my mind, I thought, okay, well, if 4 hours is the maximum that I should be doing on the daily, then I need to be hitting that optimum goal every single day consistently. And if I do anything less than that on any day, then that's unacceptable, which is perfectionism at its peak, right? So I found it really, really difficult to ever allow myself to lower my expectations of myself. And if I was having a particularly rough day where I just felt really low or tired or sick, or my motivation was through the floor, or even if I was having a depressive episode, I found it really difficult to say, okay, 4 hours, realistically, probably not going to happen today, But if I just aim for 2, or even if I just aim to get half an hour's work done, that'll be better than nothing. I was extremely black and white with this amount of work is good, anything less than that amount of work is bad, and if I think that I'm not going to achieve this good amount on any given day, then I'm going to throw the towel in and give up and not try anymore, which is exactly the kind of behaviour that all of those Instagram reels were analogies for. And from a rational and logical standpoint, it is foolish behaviour, because anybody knows that getting something done or a small amount of work done is going to reap better results than getting nothing done. But I think one of the reasons that so many highly intelligent and logically sound people who have this perfectionist tendency of thinking engage in this seemingly very illogical behaviour is that perfectionism warps the value that we assign to measurable things, like the amount of hours we've spent studying or the grades that we've achieved. If we have an attitude of the more hours I can study, the better, and the higher grade I can get, the better, then 2 hours studying holds more value than none, and getting a C holds more value than getting a U. However, when we start thinking through the lens of perfectionism, which tells us that anything less than perfect is not good enough and is worthless, if we do anything less than that elusive 4 hours of practice a day, it holds no value. 2 hours of practice now holds the same value as 0 hours of practice, because just like 0, those 2 hours aren't good enough. They're worthless to us. They hold no value. If we've done 2, we may as well have done 0. And that's where I think perfectionism skewers some people's sense of logic, because it changes the value that we assign to progress. And then the next step to that line of thinking is that if you can choose between putting 2 hours of work into something and 0 minutes of work into something and getting the same result, which one are you choosing? Any sensible person is going to choose the 0 hours, because why would you put 2 hours of difficult and uncomfortable and focused work that's going to take a lot of effort and attention and energy into something that you could get for no effort at all? That's how I think perfectionism warps our sense of logic, and how that black and white thinking can seem so reasonable to us. Another reason that I couldn't stomach the thought of doing a couple of hours of practice in a day instead of doing 4 hours or none was that to consciously choose to do that 2 hours would be giving up and admitting failure. To consciously choose to do that quote unquote little amount of work, in my mind at the time, would have been surrendering to not being good enough. Whereas at least if I don't try, I can't fail. It's the same reasoning behind refusing to let yourself take a proper break on a day when you're really struggling, which would be something like taking an hour or 2 for a hobby, like reading or going out for a coffee with a friend. I used to do this thing all the time where I'd be exhausted and miserable, and a break and activity like that probably would have done me wonders, but instead I would spend 2 hours doing nothing or flicking between news articles and social media and different apps on my phone. Because if I made a conscious decision to do something that would be recharging, that would have been me choosing leisure time over doing something productive, which was unacceptable. Whereas if I wasted those 2 hours doing fuck all and just feeling bad about myself, at least I hadn't chosen to do something with my time that wasn't study or practice. You know, I wasn't wasting time not practicing, I was just not doing anything. Now, in reality, I was getting just as little work done as I would have done if I'd have gone out for that coffee. But doing nothing didn't feel like admitting defeat as much as going out for the coffee would have done. But obviously the problem with this is that going for the coffee probably would have been much healthier and recharging for me, which would have benefited my academic performance in the long run. Whereas feeling progressively worse doing nothing for 2 hours multiple times a week had the opposite effect. But going back to the values line of thought, I've got another gaming analogy to try and illustrate this. If you are familiar with Mario Kart, you know that in each race there are 12 players, and each position at the end of a race is worth a different amount of points. So if you come first, you get 15 points. If you come second, you get 12. And if you come last, you get 0. And all the other positions in between are worth different numbers of points. Someone who has really high standards might aim for first place, but still be happy if they get second or third, or even something further down like 6th or 10th, because whilst it's not worth the 15 points that first is worth, it's still worth 12 or 10 or 6 or even 2 points, which is worth more than 0, which is what you would get for last place. However, a perfectionist might not see the world that way. So they might see first place, which represents perfection, as being worth 15 points, and every other place on the leaderboard as worth 0. So essentially the same as last place would be worth. So they give up after making one mistake because in their mind, they've already put themselves in last place with no return. They give up trying anymore because there is nothing left to be achieved. But it is so much healthier to start seeing 10th and 5th and 2nd place as worth something again, because it might cause us a lot less harm to get to 10th or 2nd place than it would to try and get to 1st consistently. And those positions will have less of a negative impact on our lives than 12th place would, which might represent things like not turning up to exams or being petrified when we do have to do exams because we have done no preparation, which could lead to things like not getting the grades that we want and subsequently not getting into the uni or not getting the job that we want to get. I guess another scenario you could think about it in is somebody who has some health and fitness goals. Maybe they want to lose some weight to improve their physical health, which they're doing through a calorie deficit and workout program. And one day for lunch, they accidentally eat more than their allotted calories. Well, accidentally or intentionally, it doesn't really matter. But they make one mistake, one slip up, something that they didn't intend to do. And they think, fuck it. And they throw the plan in the bin for the rest of the day and they eat whatever the hell they want, and they skip the gym session that they had planned for after work while they're at it as well. From an outside perspective, or from a perspective of somebody who might not be able to empathize with the perfectionist line of thinking, you might think that those actions are ridiculous and illogical and foolish, but actually I think to a perfectionist they can make complete sense. Because if you then consider the fact that it might be taking them a serious amount of willpower and discomfort to hold themselves accountable to that plan, if they've already made a mistake that they deem to be irredeemable, and which means that they're going to feel just as badly about themselves at the end of the day than they would if they follow through with a plan after they've made a mistake, then why the hell are they going to carry on putting in the hard work and pushing through their feelings and doing the difficult thing? If they're going to feel the same at the end of the day as they would if they gave up and made easy decisions for the next 8 hours. Now that is what doesn't make sense. It goes against human nature to carry on engaging in a behaviour with nothing driving you towards it. And if you don't have the possibility of an acceptable day's work or rewards to show for it at the end of the day, if that possibility is out of the window, then it doesn't make any sense to keep working towards it. There's effectively nothing left driving you towards making those difficult choices. I also just think that continuing to work on a day that you view to have already ruined is just going to be a consistent reminder that we're not good enough by our own standards and that we've failed the day, or even worse, that we're a failure as a person. We are not good enough. Whereas throwing the towel in and turning to something more comforting, like rotting in bed for the rest of the day or watching TV or scrolling or doing nothing, can feel less mentally painful because it is a distraction from all those uncomfortable thoughts and feelings. So that is why I think that the perfectionist sometimes thinks and behaves in the way that they do. But the problem is that this logic and acting in accordance to it is so detrimental to our lives, which is why I think it is so important to firstly be able to recognize it in yourself if this is you, and secondly learn how to start rewriting those thought patterns and beliefs so that we can start changing our behaviour. I'm sure loads of people listening can relate at least partially to something I've said so far, because perfectionism actually stems from very common human fears, like the fears of rejection, judgment, not being good enough or worthy of love and attention, all natural human fears. And whilst I think it's normal and not unhealthy to experience these fears from time to time, I don't think perfectionism is a healthy coping strategy for them. I think it's a maladaptive one, meaning that it's almost certainly going to cause us more harm in the long run. But this is the first piece of information that I think is key to understanding perfectionist tendencies. Perfectionism is more than a personality trait or quirk. It's actually a coping mechanism that we develop to try and protect ourselves from these things that we're so scared of. I was thinking about my first 2 episodes when I was writing this, and about how I basically said that I don't think laziness is really real. Just like laziness, I think perfectionism is essentially fear-driven behaviour, but whilst laziness is driven by the fear of discomfort, perfectionism is driven by a fear of not being good enough. We call ourselves perfectionists like we call ourselves ambitious or shy or extroverted or optimistic or any other personality trait. Whereas it's not like any of those things in that category. It is a protective mechanism / fear response / maladaptive coping strategy. And you need to see it as such instead of seeing it as a part of who you are if you're going to combat it. You're not a perfectionist, you're just scared of something. So the first thing to ask yourself is, what am I afraid of? A perfectionist's mind thinks, if I am not perfect, I risk insert X fear here, whichever applies for you. But for example, people seeing me as less than them, or people seeing me as less than good enough. Perfectionism is the only way to protect myself from this, because unless I am perfect, there will always be somebody better than me, or I will always have been able to do a certain task better, or there will always be a chance that I won't achieve my dream job, whatever the fear is for you. So perfectionism is a product of insecurity and an inability to deal with this universal statement and truth that we are beautifully flawed creatures. Although we know it's impossible, we strive for perfection because it's the only way that we can shield ourselves from being outperformed or knowing that we could have done something better. We think that by striving to be perfect, we can eradicate any vulnerability within us, but by doing this, we're just feeding into and increasing our fears, because we're telling ourselves that in the event that we were judged or criticized or rejected, then we wouldn't be able to cope with it. Subconsciously, I think that the perfectionist has an intense fear of one or multiple of these things happening. And they also know that the only way to avoid ever making a mistake or not living up to somebody else's standards, which would lead to this rejection or judgment happening, is to become completely inscrutable, flawless, perfect. So instead of working on how we could handle rejection and the emotions that would come up for us were it to happen, which I think would be a healthy coping strategy, we instead work on becoming flawless and indestructible. But the very obvious problem with that is that it is an impossible task because we are an inherently flawed species. So it's not a healthy coping strategy. Instead of seeing our mistakes for what they are, which are inevitable parts of the human experience and things to be learnt from, it's like we see them as the end of the world and a reflection on who we are as a person, maybe even making ourselves complete failures in our own eyes. That's a hell of a lot of pressure to put on one person to avoid making any mistakes ever. But I think the fantasy of perfectionism potentially being achievable and working as a protection against all of these things that we're so scared of is what keeps so many people engaging in this really pressurized and painful mentality. So part of the aim today is to disillusion you from the fantasy of perfectionism and to talk about some healthier alternative beliefs and coping strategies, which initially might feel much scarier because you're opening yourself up to being in a position where you might actually have to use them, as opposed to carrying on a tradition of not turning out to exams, which, guilty. But I think in the long run, you will feel safer and more in control and happier because of it. Obviously, I hope the conversation on how perfectionism warps your sense of value and holds you back from progressing and how much pressure it puts you under was the first step to disillusioning you from it. But now I want to talk about another harmful behaviour that perfectionism can cause, which is paralysis. To me, this is almost like stage 2 of extreme perfectionist behaviour, because this is when it goes beyond just giving up when you make a mistake and you get into the territory of not being able to try to do any work at all, or not even being able to start a new workout or a meal plan at all. Because if you can say that you never tried, you can also say that you never failed, which for obvious reasons is even more damaging. This is another symptom / behaviour that I was extremely guilty of throughout my academic years. I remember really specifically when this started, and it was when I was doing GCSE mock, so I would have been like 14, and there was an English literature mock that we did, and we got given 2 essay questions, one on Macbeth, one on Jekyll and Hyde, I think it was we were studying. Got given them in advance, and I decided before this exam that I did not have time to prepare what I deemed to be a perfect essay response to both of these questions. So I was like, I'm going to ignore the Macbeth one, like ignore it completely, and just answer the Jekyll and Hyde one. I'm going to prepare a perfect answer to that and turn that in and nothing else, so that my teacher won't have anything less than perfect to judge me on for the other question. And I continued to pull this kind of shit all through my uni years, which I'm not like proud to admit. It's not a coping strategy that I would recommend to anyone, and it caused me so many problems throughout uni. There were so many times where I said I was ill to get out of doing things because I didn't believe I could do them up to a standard that I deemed acceptable. And I'm not only talking about exams. I did it for exams all the time, but it also got to a point where I did it for one-to-one lessons with my violin teacher or with the pianist for the string department. Or I'd do it for classes where I was literally just going to be playing to my peers for feedback. I was so scared of being perceived as not good enough or unimpressive by other people that if I didn't think that I was going to be able to go into a class and play at what I deemed to be an acceptable standard, which was near enough perfection, then I simply wasn't going to do it. But the irony is, through doing that, I just drifted further and further away from that standard that I'd set for myself because I missed out on so many opportunities, which I was paying a fuck ton of money for, to get feedback and learn from my mistakes. And that's the double-edged sword of perfectionism. If you try and don't meet your perfect standards because you're not a flawlessly programmed computer, then you feel awful about yourself. But if you don't try in order to protect yourself from those feelings, then you stop yourself from being able to achieve anything at all. But we have to be able to make mistakes in order to learn how to not do something so that we can get one step closer to learning how to do it. That's how most things in life work. If you don't push or allow yourself to ever be in a scenario where you're potentially gonna make a mistake, then you stop yourself being able to grow or make any kind of progress, because you won't even be able to make the mistakes that it takes to get to the standard that you want to get to. Basically, you're fighting a battle in vain and moving yourself away from a thing that you're trying to get. So in that sense, I think perfectionism can genuinely ruin your life, hold you back from your dreams, and stop you from ever achieving your true potential. But if we recognise that failing and or not being perfect and getting feedback from it can help us improve, we actually allow ourselves to get closer to our goals of high achievement. But if we recognise that failing and or not being perfect and getting feedback from it can actually help us improve, we actually allow ourselves to get closer to our goals of extremely high achievement. Then we have the effect that the pursuit of this perfection fantasy is actually having on you in terms of the emotions that it causes. When we consistently engage unchecked in thought patterns and behaviours fueled by fear, the fear intensifies, which when experienced over a prolonged period of time is going to cause us significant and reoccurring stress and anxiety. There's a really good Psychology of Your 20s podcast episode on perfectionism, which said that in a study by the National Institute of Health, it was found that, to quote, people with high perfectionist worries experienced increased feelings of hopelessness and a lack of control in the face of their uncontrollable pursuit of perfectionism, resulting in paralysis and lower academic performance. And it also noted that perfectionism was negatively correlated to well-being. I also think it's worth thinking about the effect that paralysis can have on your self-esteem and how quickly you can get stuck in a vicious cycle of, I don't feel good enough to do that work, so I'm not going to do it, which is going to result in lower academic performance, which is going to make me feel even worse about myself and even less capable of doing the work than I did before, which then makes you even more reliant on this coping mechanism of avoidance, and so the feelings perpetuate and intensify. The question that came to my mind as I was writing all these notes on the negative effects of perfectionism on us was, is the comfort of the fantasy of one day being perfect, whether that's academic or otherwise, is the comfort of this fantasy actually worth the cost of everything I've just talked about? Because I think what's actually happening is that you're paying for protection from one type of pain, which is the pain of feeling like a failure or being perceived as one. You're paying for protection from that with another pain, which is feeling constantly helpless, out of control, anxious, stressed, depressed, low self-esteem, and having your academic and work performance actually be negatively impacted. Is it worth that? I think that's what people's eyes actually need opening to, is that when you zoom out, you're actually not protecting yourself from pain at all. Just ask yourself whether your happiness is worth destroying for an academic outcome. Because if something doesn't bring you or somebody else happiness, then what's the point of it at all? I did speak about this whole thought reframing process in my episode on body image, but I also think it's really relevant here. In that one, I spoke about how when I dug to the core of my desire for the perfect nose, it was actually a desire to feel good about myself and feel worthy. But what I spoke about was that I ended up feeling good about myself and worthy without going to the extreme of getting a nose job. And in this scenario, I think you can feel worthy of love and good about yourself without driving yourself to extreme levels of stress and burnout and mental fatigue in the pursuit of ridiculously and constantly high grades. There are other paths to feeling good about yourself to choose instead. So now that I think I've done enough hammering in the perfectionism is bad message, why is it that having high standards, in my opinion, is a great thing and perfectionism is a harmful one? And what's the difference between the two of them? Having high standards to me is saying that I'm going to work really hard on this degree and do it to the best of my ability. And even if I don't get a perfect or top grade, that is good enough for me. If I know that I worked really hard on it and I know where it went wrong and I know what I can do to improve, and if I didn't cause myself any harm on my way there, that is good enough for me, and that I think is having high standards and is healthy. Whereas I think perfectionism is saying that I'm going to do whatever it takes to get as close to perfection as possible, regardless of how it impacts my well-being, and if I don't get there, that is not good enough. Essentially, even if I do my best, if it's not perfection, my best is not good enough. But being willing to put yourself in harm's way in the name of high standards, I think, is potentially where the line is crossed into perfectionism and where the difference between the two maybe lies. Having high standards is saying, I will be okay if I don't do as well as I thought I would or wanted to. Whereas perfectionism is saying, I will not be okay, and this will say something about my self-worth and cause me emotional distress. So when our high standards are coming at the expense of really, really important things like our physical and mental health and enjoyment of life, I think that's when we might need to adjust our expectations of ourselves. I think another key difference between having high standards and perfectionism is that high standards does not equal aiming for the impossible, which perfectionism does, because as we've already established, consistent perfection is not a possible outcome for humans. We are not robots, we are a beautifully flawed living species instead. Back in November, I posted a short from one of my other episodes where I was talking about perfectionism briefly, and somebody commented on it and said, don't you think that we should be aiming for perfection whilst acknowledging the human condition, because the alternative essentially is not setting a high enough standard to give us the edge for growth. One of the first things that I thought is that actually when you start to get specific about what it is that you want to be perfect at, it can start to sound silly. And hear me out. If you said that I want to start aiming to work 25 hours in a day, or I want to be able to run 100 meters in 6 seconds, which I Googled and is theoretically impossible. So, point being, you wouldn't set yourself either of those goals because they're impossible. So when people talk about aiming for perfection, in my mind, it is the same as saying that I'm aiming to work 25 hours in a day, or I'm aiming to run 100 meters in 6 seconds. You're setting yourself up for failure because they're not achievable. You would never set yourself a factually proven, unattainable goal in a specific field and pursue it like it is attainable. But I think it is more than possible to challenge yourself and grow with very high standards that are still achievable and won't rob you of either your health or happiness on the way there. So finally, let's start talking about how we can actually overcome perfectionist tendencies so that we aren't putting our happiness on the line every time we make a mistake or don't live up to our own expectations. For me personally, I do think the most effective way of fighting my own perfectionism has been through developing a deeper understanding of it and what fuels it and how it changes my sense of logic and how else it negatively impacts me. So this last section is mostly extra things that have helped me out or could help somebody else out, but different things are going to work and click for different people. So for somebody else, one of these things that are like an extra for me could be the big thing that actually moves the needle and makes positive change for them. Firstly, I am a big visualization girly. I think it's an amazing psychological technique which puts some distance between me and my thoughts and allows me to look at them objectively and as something separate from me. I like giving names and characters to different thought patterns in my head and imagining that they're somebody separate from me thinking, because it makes it easier for me to distinguish between learned thought patterns and my higher self, or the way that I would want to think. and therefore easier to decide when to listen to what my brain's telling me and when not to. Anybody who's listened from the start of the podcast will know that Stig is the name that I gave to my lower brain. He is Stig the caveman. So perfectionism is another character in my brain. He doesn't have a name, but I see him as like this bulky blue monster man made of like orbs, and his heart is powered by fear, but specifically the fear of being judged as not good enough or unlovable or unworthy of attention. But your perfectionism will be powered by your own unique fears, so I think it's really worthwhile having a think as to what those might be. So my fears are a natural and healthy part of being human, and to some extent they're keeping me safe, because if I didn't care about being loved and connecting with other people, then I probably wouldn't be very good at maintaining my relationships, and then I'd probably be very lonely, which also wouldn't be very healthy for me. But I think taking away some of that fear's power and quietening its voice yapping up inside your head can be even healthier, because you don't want it to be overwhelming or disproportionate to the scenario at hand at any point. You never want the fear to be in absolute control. Whenever I'm engaging in anything like trying to choose alternative thoughts to the ones that my perfectionism serves up to me, or engaging in journaling exercises to fight perfectionism, or using affirmations, all of the little techniques that I use, every time I use them, I try and pair them with visualization. And I imagine like taking little blue orbs off this big blue blobby Michelin man in my head and shrinking him and taking away his power, so that my higher self can have a fighting chance of getting him out of the driver's seat for a bit. Because when perfectionism dominates my thoughts, he causes me constant feelings of low self-esteem and anxiety. Like I always say, the first step to any sort of change is awareness. So if you can practice identifying when it is that perfectionism is in the driver's seat up in your noggin, it will be easier to reject his thinking and choose other more healthy, happy thoughts instead. Visualizing perfectionism helps me with that identification. It helps me realize when it is perfectionism talking, so that I can get my higher self back in the driving seat as quickly as possible. So following on from that, I think one of the first steps to overcoming perfectionism is working out where it might have stemmed from for you. I do not think we are born with a fear of not being good enough academically, or not getting good enough A levels, or not being the highest achiever at our uni. I think we develop those fears probably most of the time from lessons that we learn as children. And I think you can develop perfectionist tendencies from external messaging that you are consistently receiving as an adult. But I think there are specific reasons why it is so common for children to develop these beliefs. If as a kid you had caregivers or parents who had very high academic expectations of you, you can end up internalizing those standards, because as a child, your relationship with your parents are so important to you being looked after and then ultimately you surviving. Children are also still constantly developing an understanding of the world around them, and for a long time their main point of reference as to what is correct is going to be their parents' viewpoint. So if as a child you bring a test paper home that you've done really well on, you got say 36 out of 40, you only dropped 4 marks, but instead of saying, oh, well done, you tried so hard for that test, I'm so proud of you, or well done, that's an excellent mark, your parent says, well, where did the last 4 marks go? Or, well, how did the other people in your class do? Subconsciously, you learn that doing your best isn't enough. It won't make my parents love or approve of me. What's important is that I do better than my peers in my class, and that I get the maximum mark possible. Dropping any points is bad. And that subconscious lesson manifests as a conscious fear of being outperformed by other people or making any mistakes at all. Or say you did really badly on a test and you took it home, and instead of saying, hey, it's okay, I still love you, I'm proud of you, I know you tried really hard, what can I do to support you and help you improve next time, your parent scolds you or withdraws attention and showers your sibling who maybe did better than you in love and attention instead. Subconsciously, you then learn that love is conditional upon academic performance, and it's something that has to be earned, and if it's not earned, then it's withdrawn. You are a child. Your subconscious does not understand that your parents' opinion of what is good enough is not absolute fact, but without any intervention, you carry those standards and subsequent fears into adulthood with you. So if perfectionism is something that you struggle with, I know this isn't where it's going to come from for everybody, but I think if it's something you want to understand more about, it can be useful to think back to your childhood and see if you can remember any times where you felt like very high expectations were put on you, academic or otherwise, by a parent or teacher, and think about whether you can remember how it made you feel. And was it sad or scared or unloved or rejected or negatively judged or criticized maybe? Or think about whether there were any patterns in your childhood in terms of when you received lots of love and praise and attention and when you felt like it was maybe missed, and see if you can remember whether there were any correlations between those things and your academic performance at the time. So now when you feel the fear of being perceived as less than as an adult, is it you feeling that fear, or is it the child version of you that's still inside you reacting? Because you now get to choose what is good enough for you. You're not a child anymore. You're not dependent on your parents' love and approval for survival. You can give yourself the love and approval and validation that maybe they didn't when you didn't meet their standards at that time. Identifying where in my childhood I personally think my perfectionism probably stemmed from took away a lot of Mr. Blue Blobby Man's power. Because I think when you start to see thought patterns as simply a result of past events, as opposed to valid beliefs based off of absolute fact, it takes away some of their validity and power. And then you're equipped to make the choice to reject them and replace them and choose your own beliefs and standards instead of the ones that your parents set for you. So have a think about what your fear is and why you fear it. So what negative memories do you have of feeling rejected or judged or unloved when you weren't perfect in an aspect of your life? And think about whether you want the fear of a repeat of that event to control your behaviour for the rest of your life, or whether you want to put your efforts into better equipping yourself to deal with those emotions were they ever to arise again. But please acknowledge your fears, because your fears thrive in the dark. And when you acknowledge them, they might not ever fully go away, but you can learn to better live with them. Realigning or reframing your expectations around what good achievement means to you and where your self-worth comes from is the next really important step. It might be a hard pill to swallow for some people, but the value and worth that you assign to different achievements is subjective. What seems like a big and worthwhile achievement to you might not hold as much value to somebody else, and vice versa. And the achievements that you see as the utmost of importance might not gain you much approval or validation or love from somebody else who values different things. So whilst it is very hard, you can change a way that you perceive different achievements and the value that you assign to them. And yeah, of course, external influences are gonna play a huge role in what you see as important. And if you have parents who did place very high academic expectations on you, I think it figures that you're going to have very high expectations of yourself in your academic and career performance as an adult. And you then might find it very difficult to undo that conditioning and detach your self-worth from your achievements, because that was what your subconscious was taught to do at such a young age consistently. But whilst it's difficult, it's definitely not impossible. There are so many different methods of doing this, and I'm going to do a whistle-stop tour of a few of them which I have found to help personally, or just that I really like, ideas that I've gotten from other places. So I'm going to do a bit of looking at notes for this bit. The first one is journaling exercises. There are loads of different prompts and formats that I think can be used to help with this. And there's one on limiting beliefs that I went through in episode 6, and I won't go through it again for the sake of time, but I'll put the timestamp for it in this episode description if you want to go back and listen to that. But there's another one that I found really helpful for perfectionism specifically, which is the zigzag format, which I learned about in cognitive behavioural therapy a few years ago. So you start with a blank piece of paper, and in the top left-hand corner, you write down an unhealthy belief that you have, which might be, for example, if I am not academically perfect, I am not special, and therefore I am unlovable. And then you draw a line coming diagonally downwards to the right hand side of the paper, and you write basically a counter argument to this statement. So I could write something like, well, actually, factually, I know that different people value different things, and I know that my boyfriend thinks that I'm special, and loves me because of how caring I am. That would be the counter argument. If you're watching the video and it now looks like I've been crying, I just had a coughing fit. I don't know how much the camera is going to pick up, but what I was going to say is, so actually his love for me is not dependent on my academic achievement. So then you draw another line going diagonally down back to the left-hand side of the paper, and you do a counter argument for that, so a defense for your original statement, which might be, well, yeah, maybe he does love me because of how caring I am, but he might love me more and think I'm more special if I was a higher achiever. To which I would do another diagonal line, making a zigzag down my page, and write, well, actually, I don't have any evidence to support that because throughout our relationship, his love and affection towards me haven't fluctuated based on how well I'm currently doing at uni or in my career. And you keep zigzagging down this page until the right-hand side has basically won. And I remember my therapist saying to me at the time that we were doing this, but basically when the left-hand side has resorted to saying things like, well, I just think you're wrong, or that's stupid, or name-calling, that's when you know that the counter-argument has won. The next one is affirmations. I know affirmations get a really bad rep from some people, but I think they can be used in a way that is genuinely really helpful. Shouting things like, I am enough, and I love myself regardless of what grades I achieve, and I don't care what marks I get, when you know that you don't fully believe those things yet, isn't going to do a whole lot. But it can be really helpful to practice an affirmation that you can believe, and saying it to yourself in the mirror once or twice a day, or writing it down once or twice a day, or putting it somewhere like on a sticky note where you're going to be reminded of it, like on the bathroom mirror. To give an example, you could think about what things you like about yourself or value about yourself outside of your academic achievements, like how you're a good friend, or how empathetic you are, or your good sense of humour, or even something like your honesty. And then practice writing or saying, I have worth and value outside of my academic achievement and performance, and one of the things I value about myself is insert blank personality trait. So even if you feel like you're not good enough for yourself or other people yet because of your academic performance, you can recognize that, well, actually, there is something else that I value about myself. And maybe the more I actively practice focusing on it, the closer I'll get to one day believing that, do you know what, that's enough for me, regardless of what I achieve. I think it's a positive first baby step. The next is celebrating your smaller successes. I heard this thing specifically on another Psychology of Your 20s podcast episode on how to make your life more fun, and I love the idea of it. And it's keeping like bowls of party poppers around your house for whenever you make any small achievement, which I understand from a cleaning perspective probably isn't the most practical, but I think in terms of what it could do for your like mental health and happiness, it's probably worth it. I'm yet to try it, but it will definitely be something that I'm picking up and doing at some point, and I honestly can't wait. I just think it's really fun, but you can choose a less messy, more practical, meaningful reward to you if you'd rather, like picking yourself up a sweet treat, or coffee, or getting yourself some flowers, or calling a loved one when you do something scary that you're proud of, like turning up to an exam that you didn't feel 120% prepared for, or whenever you get a mark back on a paper, regardless of whether it was good or bad. But what's important is doing something to positively reinforce good new habits, because that will eventually teach your subconscious that imperfect action and achievement is a positive thing associated with positive emotions and self-love and rewarding yourself, instead of being associated with the negative emotions of rejection from a caregiver or teacher. Taking manageable risks is next. This kind of links into the last one, but this means turning up to that exam that you're not 110% prepared for, turning in the paper that, yes, theoretically you could do more work on and make more perfect, but realistically you've put more than enough hard work and time and effort into. And then you go back to your comfort zone and celebrate yourself after with the party poppers or whatever the treat is for you. Taking action builds confidence, which builds security within yourself, which leads to less focusing and obsessing over your perceived shortcomings, which then makes it easier for you to take more positive action. In other words, taking action is stepping up into a positive upward spiral of confidence and bravery, as opposed to stepping into a downward negative spiral of fear. I do think the people you surround yourself with and your environment is such an important factor as well. And whilst it is all well and good doing lots of work on your internal voice, I think if you are consistently giving negative and judgmental and very critical people access to you, you're essentially giving those voices unfiltered access to your subconscious, which is going to be really hard to continue doing positive self-work whilst combating with that constantly. Basically, if you want to change your internal dialogue, you also need to start assessing the external voices that you're listening to and effectively giving access to your subconscious. So if there are people in your life who you feel negatively judged by when you're not excelling academically, it might be worth evaluating whether that's a positive relationship for you to have. Or better yet, maybe first have a conversation where you say, hey, when you only ask me questions about how my degree is going or how my exams are going, or when you are a lot more affectionate towards me when I am excelling academically, it makes me feel really scared to underperform, which puts a lot of negative pressure on me. Or just talk to the people that you love and the people surrounding you about your perfectionism and where you think it comes from and how it makes you feel, and then they'll be better set up to help you with it. I always think the more you communicate with your loved ones and the more intel you give them into what's going on in your internal world, the better you equip them to support and love you properly. One of my favourite memories, weirdly enough, is from the day of my final exam at university. And for context, the final exam was my final recital on my violin, and I had not been feeling well mentally for quite a while running up to it. It had been causing me a lot of stress. By the end of the degree, I was not in a good place, and it had started to affect me physically as well. I was barely eating. So this day was kind of like the culmination of all this pressure. And I think it's quite standard on final recital day when loved ones come to watch, they'll give people cards and flowers and stuff after. Like, that's quite normal. But I only had my boyfriend coming to watch and my teacher, actually. I think that was kind of like all I wanted. And on the morning of the exam, Ed gave me some flowers and a card that he'd written, and the card said things like, you know, I love you so much and I'm so proud of you and you've worked so hard, and like I've been so proud to watch you like persevere through this tough patch. And all of that meant a lot, but I think the thing that meant the most to me was that he said, I wanted to give these to you before you went into the exam so that you knew that I loved you and I was proud of you, like no matter what happens today, no matter whether you choose to go in. And even him just saying that felt like it took an elephant off my back that I didn't even know was there. And I felt so much more empowered and supported to go into that exam hall and give what I knew wasn't going to be a first class performance and wasn't going to be the perfect final performance that 11-year-old me and 18-year-old me would have thought was the be all and end all those years ago if you'd asked her. And I held on to those words, and they helped me so much when I got the mark back and I got a 2-2 in that last ever recital, to say to myself, do you know what? Actually, this doesn't change anything. I still love myself and I'm proud of myself. My boyfriend still loves me and is proud of me. I worked really, really hard at this degree for 5 years. And I turned up to that exam even when I was absolutely petrified and I'd been feeling sick for weeks. I was brave and I persevered, and those are things to be so much more proud of myself for than the mark that I got at the end of it. And I can tell you for a fact that if I went back and talked to teenage Anya now, I'm almost 100% sure she would still be distraught if she knew that she didn't get a first class degree at the end of those 5 years. But do you know what? It happened. And I still love myself so much more now than I ever have done. So if you take away anything from that, maybe take away the fact that it is possible to stop being scared of not being perfect and to shed that expectation of yourself and to feel worthy and valuable and lovable without it. You just have to start validating yourself instead of looking for that validation from the people who set those expectations for you in the first place. I want to finish with a massive cliche and say that, very unoriginally, I think that part of what makes human beings so beautiful is that they are so messy and flawed and complex and imperfect. And just like art and nature, we were not flawlessly constructed. But that's what makes us so beautiful, and our flaws are such a precious and important and lovable part of us. They're part of what makes you so interesting and layered, and without them there'd be no room for growth or development, which would make life a lot more boring, and I'd potentially go as far as to say even pointless. I think a lot of life is 3 steps forward, 1 step back, and it's not the step back that's important, it's how you respond to it. You can focus on that 1 screw up out of 6 and go on a downward spiral and let it affect your self-esteem and think, oh, what if I make a mistake again, and what if I take another ego hit, and what if I never become who I want to be or where I want to go. Or you can focus on the 5 steps that you took forward, make adjustments where needed for the mistake, and move on up. Also, if you take away one tiny thing from this episode, maybe it could be that if self-criticism fuels perfectionism, maybe the antidote is more self-compassion. This could even be your chosen affirmation. I've written this down. The more compassionate I am towards myself, the less I will struggle with perfectionism, and the further I'll be able to go. Write it down somewhere where you'll see it regularly, and let yourself be reminded of that throughout your days. And that is all I've got for today. I genuinely have so much love for whoever's gotten to this point or whoever's listened at all. Thank you so much. And I really hope this was able to help somebody. I feel like I need to say all the usual bits. If you got anything positive from this or enjoyed it or learned anything, please consider following me or giving me thumbs up, star rating, review, comment. Any kind of engagement would help me get this out to more people. And the more people it gets out to, the more chance it has of landing with someone who could really benefit from it. So if you could do that, I would be extremely eternally grateful. I hope you have an amazing rest of your day and an amazing rest of your week, and I will speak to you in the next episode. Remember to be compassionate with yourself. I love you so much, and bye for now.